I, Emily Carter. And let me tell you a story, my story. The one I never thought I'd have to fight to keep. I wasn't born into wealth or privilege. I was raised by two people who taught me that love and integrity mattered more than any name or fortune. When my mother died and my father was left in a wheelchair, I learned young that life could turn cruel in an instant. And then I met Drew, a man who didn't see me as damaged or less than. He saw me. We built a life together that wasn't perfect, but it was ours. But when Drew was taken from me, everything we had, everything he left behind, became a battleground. Suddenly, I wasn't just fighting grief. I was fighting the people who thought they could erase me and steal what was rightfully mine. This is the story of how I stood my ground. For my husband's memory, for my father, and for the child growing inside me. Because sometimes the quietest battles become the fiercest ones. Chapter 1. The Night That Took Everything. The phone rang once, then twice. On the third ring, my grandmother answered, and my life was never the same again. I was 9 years old that winter, still too young to understand how fragile happiness could be. That evening, the air smelled of cinnamon and pine. My grandmother had baked her famous apple pie. Snow piled high against the windows of our little house in Beaverton, Oregon, muffling the sounds of the world beyond. My parents had gone to a banquet in Portland, where they were honoring my father for his work as a journalist. I had begged to go along, but Grandma Ruth insisted I stay and promised an evening of cartoons and sweet treats. I remember lying on the living room floor, head propped on a cushion, eyes fixed on the flickering screen. Grandma sat knitting in her favorite armchair, humming softly. Then the phone rang. The sound cut through the warmth of the room like a blade. Grandma set her knitting aside and stood slowly, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice. On the third ring, she picked up. "Hello?" I watched her face change, her cheeks drained of color, her knuckles whitening around the receiver. The words came out in small, broken gasps. "Oh, no, no!" I sat up, heart pounding. The air felt heavier, as if something invisible was pressing down on me. When she hung up, she didn't speak. She knelt beside me, pulled me close, and whispered through a cracked voice, "Sweetheart, there's been an accident." The drive to the hospital blurred into a haze of cold darkness and flashing lights. I clutched Grandma's hand the entire way, refusing to ask questions I wasn't ready to hear answers to. When we arrived, the sterile smell of antiseptic burned my nose. In a small waiting room, a nurse explained. A drunk driver had crossed into the wrong lane on Highway 26. My mother, Margaret Carter, was killed on impact. My father, William Carter, had survived, but both his legs were crushed beyond repair. She didn't make it, the nurse repeated gently, as if saying it softer would hurt less. I remember staring at her lips moving, unable to process the meaning. In my child's mind, this couldn't be real. Mom was supposed to come home. Tomorrow we were going to decorate the Christmas tree. When they finally let me see my father, the sight was worse than anything my mind could have conjured. He lay pale and still in a hospital bed, tubes snaking around his body. His eyes were sunken, dark circles etched beneath them. His hands trembled as he reached out toward me. "Emily, I'm so sorry." The words rasped from his throat, barely audible. I didn't understand why he was apologizing. This wasn't his fault. But in his gaze I saw a depth of guilt no words could explain. I climbed onto the chair beside his bed and gripped his hand. "It's okay, Daddy. I'm here." He closed his eyes for a long moment, tears slipping down the sides of his face. "You're all I have now, sweetheart." And in that moment, a moment no child should have to face, I understood something had broken in our lives, something we could never fully put back. The weeks that followed were a blur of funerals, hospital visits, and well-meaning neighbors dropping by with casseroles and empty words. I watched my father transform, from the vibrant, driven man who chased stories and fought for justice, into a quiet figure trapped in a wheelchair. But there was steel beneath his silence. Once released from the hospital, he returned to his desk. He typed through the pain, pouring his grief and rage into words. His articles grew sharper, angrier, a voice for those who had no one to speak for them. At night, I would sit beside him as he worked. He'd rest a hand on my shoulder and say, "One day you'll be stronger than me. Just wait." Back then, I didn't believe him, but life has a way of proving things you never wanted to learn. In the months after the accident, our house became both a refuge and a reminder of what we had lost. My grandmother moved in to help for a while, but soon it was just my father and me. The living room where we once watched movies as a family now stood quieter, as if holding its breath. My mother's garden out back withered beneath the frost, untouched. At first, my father barely spoke. He spent hours staring out the window, lost in thought. The wheels of his chair locked in place. I would bring him tea or try to sit with him, but often he would gently shake his head. "Not now, sweetheart," he'd say. But the fire inside him hadn't gone out. Weeks later, one winter morning, I found him in his study, struggling to type with trembling fingers. The old typewriter clicked unevenly beneath his touch. His eyes flicked up when he saw me. "Could you help me?" he asked softly. And so began our new routine. Each afternoon after school, I would sit beside him, reading drafts aloud, fixing commas where needed, fetching books from the shelf. His words returned stronger with every article. Fierce exposes about drunk driving laws, investigative pieces on public safety. He no longer ran through the streets chasing stories, but his words carried farther than ever. Letters poured in from readers, from families who had lost loved ones the way we had. His voice mattered. It mattered more than it ever had. At night, after the writing stopped and the house fell into silence, I would sneak into my parents' bedroom. My mother's perfume still lingered faintly on her scarves draped over the dresser. Sometimes I would curl up on her side of the bed, clutching the fabric, pretending she was still there. Grief, I learned, came in waves, sudden and sharp, like icy water. One moment I would feel almost normal. The next, a memory would break me in half. But through it all, my father showed me something greater than strength. Resilience. One crisp spring evening, months after the funeral, our town held its annual community meeting. My father was invited to speak, to advocate for stronger safety laws, in my mother's name. He hesitated at first. "I can't," he murmured. "Not like this." But I knelt beside his chair and said quietly, "She would want you to." That night, dressed in his best suit, my father wheeled himself onto the community center's small stage. The room fell silent. I sat in the front row, hands clenched in my lap. "I speak to you tonight not as a journalist," he began, voice steady despite the strain, "but as a husband who lost the love of his life and as a father determined to protect others from the same fate." The room was breathless as he spoke. I watched the weight lift from his shoulders with each word. When the speech ended, the audience rose in a standing ovation. My father's gaze found mine across the room. He smiled, the first real smile I had seen in months. After that night, our home changed. Not back to what it was, but into something new. The kitchen echoed with our shared routines, making simple meals, playing old records, debating which book to read next. My father encouraged me to join clubs at school, though I often preferred evenings at home, watching him work or sitting in comfortable silence, and slowly I began to understand the invisible strength he had passed to me. A strength built not on forgetting pain, but on carrying it forward. One rainy evening, as we sorted through old family photos, my father held up a picture of my mother, smiling beneath the "He would be proud of you, you know," he whispered. "You're stronger than I ever was." I shook my head, blinking back tears. "I had you to teach me." He reached out, squeezing my hand. "One day, Emily, you'll find your own path. And when you do, don't be afraid to leave. I'll be fine." I didn't know then how soon that promise would be tested. I never forgot the words he whispered that night. "One day, you'll be stronger than me. Just wait." I didn't know then how true it would be. Would a child's quiet promise to stay strong be enough when life demands so much more? And when the only person you have left tells you to one day leave them behind? How do you carry both love and guilt in the same heart? Stay with me as Emily's journey unfolds in Chapter 2, where love meets new beginnings and old wounds are far from healed. Chapter 2. The man who saw me, he didn't flinch when I told him about my father. He smiled, as if that only made me stronger in his eyes. I first met Andrew Bennett on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon in Seattle. By then, I had grown accustomed to watching people's expressions shift the moment they learned about my past. About my father's wheelchair, about my mother's empty chair at every holiday dinner. Some people offered pity, thinly veiled behind polite smiles. Others simply avoided the conversation altogether. But Drew was different. Rachel Morgan, my loud, brilliant roommate and de facto social guide, had practically dragged me to the small cafe off East Pine Street. I was deep into my second year at Washington State University, buried in coursework and part-time tutoring, and had no real desire to expand my social circle. "Emily, you need to breathe," Rachel had insisted. "College isn't just about grades. Besides, you'll like him." I didn't argue, not really. I had learned by then that arguing with Rachel was like trying to stop the tide. And so I found myself at that table, nursing a cup of chamomile tea when he walked in. Drew wasn't flashy. No oversized gestures, no cocky grin. He wore a simple navy jacket, jeans, and carried himself with an easy confidence that didn't beg for attention. But when he smiled, that was when the room seemed to tilt ever so slightly toward him. "This is my cousin, Drew," Rachel said, her eyes twinkling. "Drew, this is Emily, the one I've been telling you about." I wanted to melt into the chair. I shot Rachel a glare, but Drew's gaze remained steady and kind. The conversation started easily. Books, music, a shared distaste for cafeteria coffee. I found myself laughing more than I had in weeks. Then, as the rain softened against the window panes, Drew leaned forward, his tone shifting. "Rachel told me a little about your family," he said gently. "If it's okay, I'd like to hear about them from you." I hesitated, years of caution wrapped around my throat. But something in his voice, in the way he asked, not demanded, loosened my defenses. "My mom passed away when I was 9, I began quietly. A drunk driver hit their car. My father survived, but he's been in a wheelchair since." I waited for the usual flicker of discomfort. It never came. Instead, Drew smiled softly. "Thank you for telling me. I get it more than you know." He went on to share his own story, how his mother had died young, how his father had worked 2 jobs to keep the family afloat. "It's not about what's lost," he said simply. "It's about what we choose to carry forward." And in that moment, something shifted. Inside me, something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Hope. Over the next few weeks, Drew and I saw each other often. He would stop by between managing his logistics team and family obligations. Sometimes we'd meet for late-night walks around campus or simple dinners at the small diner near my apartment. There was no rush between us, no grand declarations, just 2 people slowly letting walls down. The first time he met my father was on a chilly Saturday morning. I had warned William that Drew wanted to visit, but I could see the nervous tension in his hands as he wheeled himself into the living room. Drew greeted him without hesitation. They began talking, first about books, then about classic rock music. Within minutes, the room was filled with the rare sound of my father laughing. Later, as Drew and I walked back to his car, he squeezed my hand. "Your dad is incredible," he said. "I can see where you get your strength." I didn't answer. Not right away, but my heart answered for me. As the months passed, my life quietly began to reshape itself around Drew's presence. He wasn't the kind of man who swept in with grand gestures or dramatic promises. He was steady, a grounding force I didn't know I needed until I had it. In a world that often saw me as the girl with a broken family, Drew saw someone worth building a future with. The day he proposed wasn't some elaborate spectacle. There were no rose petals, no staged photographs. It was a crisp October afternoon. The leaves had just begun to turn shades of amber and red across the Seattle parks. We'd spent the morning walking along Green Lake, laughing about some absurd campus rumor Rachel had shared the night before. As we sat on a worn wooden bench, Drew reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "Emily," he began, voice quiet but sure, "I won't pretend I can fix what life has taken from you, but I can promise to be here for whatever comes next. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred my vision before I could even speak, but my answer was clear. "Yes, yes, I will." Later that evening, as we sat wrapped in a blanket on my apartment couch, the weight of reality pressed against my joy. "Drew," I began hesitantly, "there's something I need to say before we move forward." He turned to face me, eyes patient. "I can't leave my father. He needs me. I know some people might expect me to, but I won't." For a long moment, Drew said nothing. Then he smiled, that same steady smile that had drawn me in from the very start. "I've known that all along, Emily. I would never ask you to choose between us. We'll live together. We'll take care of him together. That's what family means." Relief flooded through me, mingling with love so fierce it left me breathless. Our wedding was small, intimate, held at a quaint church just outside Seattle. The pews were filled not with distant relatives or high-profile guests, but with those who mattered, close friends, trusted mentors, and of course, my father. I will never forget the moment William insisted on wheeling himself down the aisle to give me away. His hands trembled on the wheels, but his gaze never wavered. When he placed my hand into Drew's, his voice cracked slightly. "Take care of each other." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Married life began in a cozy apartment we had found in Spokane, large enough to accommodate William comfortably, with a small garden I hoped to revive in my mother's memory. Drew's work in logistics often pulled him away for short trips, but whenever he returned, our home filled with warmth. Evenings were our sanctuary, shared dinners, old movies with my father, quiet moments that stitched together a new kind of happiness. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe that the worst was behind us. That maybe, just maybe, life had finally offered a reprieve. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form. From the first meeting, Patricia Bennett had made her disapproval clear. To her, I wasn't the kind of wife she had envisioned for her son. "So, your father is in a wheelchair?" she had asked during our first dinner together, lips pursed as if tasting something sour. "Yes," I had replied calmly. "He's also a respected journalist." "A journalist?" she echoed, tone flat, eyes cold. Drew noticed, of course, later that night. He had held me close, whispering apologies I knew weren't his to give. "I don't need anyone but you," he said firmly. "We are a family now. That's what matters most." But words alone couldn't change what was brewing beneath the polite facade. Little did I know, the family I was about to marry into would never truly accept us. And their next move? It would test the very foundation we had built. Will the cracks beneath Patricia's polite facade soon shatter the fragile peace Emily and Drew have built? And when the family you marry into quietly rejects your very existence, how do you protect the life and love you fought so hard to create? Stay with me as Chapter 3 unveils the faces behind the smiles, where subtle tensions may soon erupt into open war. Chapter 3. The faces behind the smiles? The first words my future mother-in-law said to me were not a greeting, they were a judgment. The night of our engagement dinner at the Bennett estate should have been a celebration. It wasn't. I'd spent the better part of the afternoon calming my nerves. Drew had warned me, gently, that his mother had strong opinions about family, legacy, appearances. I had nodded along, too hopeful to fully grasp what that meant. "Just be yourself," he'd said as he adjusted his tie. "That's who I love. That's all that matters." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that love was enough. The Bennett estate sat perched on a hill outside Bellevue, a sprawling brick colonial framed by perfectly manicured hedges and a fountain that seemed designed more to impress than to comfort. Patricia greeted us at the door in an emerald silk dress, her blonde hair swept into an immaculate twist. The smile she offered Drew was warm, practiced. When her gaze shifted to me, the smile froze, then thinned. "So your father is in a wheelchair?" No hello. No welcome to the family. "Yes," I replied evenly, meeting her eyes. "He's also a respected journalist." "A journalist," she repeated, tone-clipped, as if testing the word against some invisible standard. Before I could respond, Samantha swept in from the hallway, all effortless grace and sharp glances. Her hug to Drew was all warmth. Her nod to me was barely a gesture. "Congratulations," she said, lips barely moving. It wasn't a blessing. It was a warning. The dinner table gleamed under a crystal chandelier. China, that likely hadn't seen daylight in years, was laid out in perfect symmetry. The conversation around the table flowed with practiced ease until Drew mentioned that we were considering having my father move in with us. "In the same house?" Patricia asked, her fork pausing midair. "Yes," Drew replied firmly. "We want him to be comfortable." A beat of silence followed. Small, sharp, and deafening. "Of course," Patricia said, voice smooth as glass. "Family should come first. Though blending families of such different backgrounds can be challenging." Her smile returned, brittle this time. I caught Samantha smirking into her wineglass. I focused on my plate, steadying my breath. I'd grown up learning to pick apart words meant to wound beneath polite veneers, and this table, this family, was a masterclass. After dinner, as I helped gather plates in the kitchen, Patricia cornered me near the marble island. "Emily," she began, voice low, "I understand you've been through a lot. But marriage into this family comes with certain expectations. Appearances matter. Connections matter." "I'm marrying Drew," I said quietly. "Not a family name." Her smile sharpened. "Names carry weight, dear. You'd be wise not to forget that." Before I could respond, Drew entered, sensing the tension. He slid an arm around my waist. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Patricia's smile brightened instantly. "Of course, darling, we were just having a little chat." But her eyes, cold, calculating, told a different story. On the drive home, I remained quiet, fingers twisting in my lap. Drew reached over, taking my hand. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I had hoped tonight would go differently." "I'm not surprised," I admitted. "But I won't let it change us." "It won't," he promised. "We'll face this together." And for that night, I let myself believe him. But beneath the surface, the battle lines had already been drawn. The weeks that followed our engagement dinner unfolded in a blur of planning and polite obligations. Drew and I were deep into wedding preparations, or rather, I was deep into preparations while Drew juggled an increasingly demanding schedule with his logistics team. Patricia's involvement was less about helping and more about control. Invitations, flower arrangements, guest lists. She had opinions on everything. "A church outside Seattle?" she questioned during one phone call. "Don't you think something more formal would better suit the Bennett name?" "We've already chosen the venue," I replied, keeping my tone even. "It holds personal meaning for us." There was a pause, long enough to make its point. "Very well," she said curtly. "Of course it's your day." But I could hear the unspoken words. "You are not my choice for him." Drew sensed the tension. After one particularly tense planning meeting, he pulled me aside. "You don't have to do this alone," he said gently. "If it gets to be too much—" "I'm fine," I assured him. "We knew this wouldn't be easy." What I didn't say was how deep the unease had begun to settle in my chest. Samantha, too, played her part with cold precision. At a casual brunch with a few of Drew's colleagues, she made no effort to disguise her disdain. "It's sweet how dedicated Emily is to her father," she remarked brightly over mimosas. "But don't you think it might be limiting for Drew's future?" I kept my expression neutral even as my stomach clenched. Drew's jaw tightened beside me. "Emily's strength is one of the reasons I love her," he said firmly. "And our future will be what we build, not what anyone else expects." The table fell awkwardly silent. Samantha's smile remained fixed, but her eyes flickered with something sharp. After that, Patricia and Samantha's visits became more frequent, especially when Drew was away on business trips. They would arrive unannounced at our Spokane home, their presence filling the space with an icy tension. Patricia would sweep through the living room, commenting on the decor, the furniture. The framed photos of my father and me. "Such a quaint little place," she mused one afternoon, fingering the edge of a worn bookshelf. "Of course, once you have a proper home, things will be different." I forced a polite smile, unwilling to give her the reaction she sought, but beneath the surface each word landed like a subtle threat. One rainy Tuesday, as I folded laundry in the kitchen, I overheard them in the next room. "It's such a shame," Patricia sighed. "Drew could have done so much better." "Exactly," Samantha replied. "He's a fool for getting involved with someone like Emily. And her. Father in a wheelchair? How embarrassing." I froze, blood pounding in my ears. For a long moment I stood there, fists clenched around a towel. Then I took a steadying breath, walked calmly into the room, and faced them. "If you have something to say," I said quietly, "say it to me." Both women blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Patricia recovered first, her smile returning. "Of course not, dear. We were just talking." "Good," I said evenly, "because this is my home and you are guests here. Please remember that." For once, Patricia had no ready retort. Samantha looked away, her expression sour. Later that night, as I recounted the encounter to Drew, he pulled me close, voice thick with frustration. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "You shouldn't have to deal with this." "We knew they wouldn't make it easy," I replied. "But I won't let them break us." I meant every word, but deep down, I couldn't shake the sense that the storm was only just beginning. How far will Patricia and Samantha go now that Emily has dared to stand her ground? And when family becomes the source of cruelty instead of comfort, how do you find the strength to keep protecting the life you've built? Don't miss Chapter 4, where tragedy strikes and Emily's fight for love and home takes a devastating new turn. Chapter 4, The Day He Never Came Home. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, too calm. And when it spoke the words, my knees gave out beneath me. It was supposed to be an ordinary morning. The sun hadn't yet broken through the gray haze hanging over Spokane. I was in the kitchen, setting out breakfast. 2 plates, 2 mugs. The quiet rhythm of routine helping to steady my mind after the latest tense encounter with Patricia and Samantha. Drew had left early for a logistics conference in Seattle. I'd kissed him goodbye at dawn, wrapped in one of his old sweaters, drowsy but content. "I'll be back before dinner," he'd promised, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. "Drive safe," I'd whispered, holding onto him a moment longer than usual. I didn't know it would be the last time. The call came just after 9. I was folding laundry when the phone rang. A number I didn't recognize. Some instinct made my stomach knot. "Hello? Mrs. Bennett?" a man's voice asked, clipped and formal. "This is Lieutenant Martin with the Washington State Police Department." My breath caught. "I'm very sorry to inform you. Your husband, Andrew Bennett, was involved in a serious accident this morning on I-90. Sank onto the edge of the bed, heart racing. There was a head-on collision. His vehicle was struck by a driver who crossed the median. Despite emergency efforts, I'm sorry, he didn't make it. The world blurred. My hand trembled, barely able to hold the phone. I couldn't seem to breathe, couldn't seem to think. No, I whispered. No, there must be some mistake. But the lieutenant's voice remained painfully calm. I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Bennett. We'll be sending an officer to assist you with next steps. The line clicked dead. I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at the silent phone in my lap. The world around me faded into static. Finally, through some haze of instinct, I called my father. The moment he answered and heard my broken voice, he knew. "Emily," he said, voice steady even as it shook. "I'm coming. You're not alone." The hours that followed moved in slow, jagged fragments. There was the officer at the door, offering condolences I couldn't hear. There was Rachel arriving, tears in her eyes as she wrapped me in an embrace. There was the drive to the funeral home, my father's wheelchair beside me as I stared blankly out the window. "He was supposed to come home," I whispered once, voice raw. "We had plans." My father squeezed my hand, his own eyes red with grief. "I know, sweetheart. I know." The funeral was held in the same small church where Drew and I had stood just months earlier, promising forever. Now, those same pews were filled with mourners in dark suits. Drew's colleagues, his friends, even old high school classmates. Patricia and Samantha were conspicuously absent. Some said it was grief, others whispered of shame or strategy. I no longer cared. When the service ended, I gripped my father's arm as we made our way to the car. The weight of loss pressed so heavily against my chest I thought it might crush me. The house that had once been filled with hope now felt colder than stone. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at Drew's empty chair. I wanted to scream, to rage against the unfairness of it all, but instead I gathered the paperwork, bank statements, insurance documents, forcing my mind to function through the fog of grief. "You're stronger than you think," my father reminded me softly. "And when you can't be, I'll be strong for both of us." I nodded, tears slipping silently down my cheeks, but deep inside I felt something shift, a quiet resolve hardening beneath the sorrow. A week after the funeral, the house remained cloaked in silence. Drew's absence echoed in every room, in the unwashed coffee mug by the sink, the jacket still draped over his office chair, the unopened bottle of wine we had planned to share that weekend. I moved through each day like a shadow, balancing grief with necessity. There were endless forms to sign, agencies to notify, accounts to close. I buried myself in the paperwork, because if I stopped moving, the pain would consume me. One gray afternoon, as I sorted through yet another stack of insurance documents, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting visitors. My father was in the study, Rachel was at work. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but something, call it instinct, compelled me to answer. Through the peephole I saw them, Patricia and Samantha, both impeccably dressed in black, as if they were late to the funeral they had never bothered to attend. I opened the door just wide enough to meet their eyes. "We need to talk," Patricia said smoothly, her voice layered in false sweetness. "I don't think there's anything left for us to discuss," I replied coldly. "Please," she pressed, "it will only take a moment." Against my better judgment, and perhaps out of morbid curiosity, I let them in. They swept into the living room as if they still owned part of it. Samantha lingered near Drew's bookshelf, running her fingers over the spines. Patricia remained standing, eyes scanning the space with calculated precision. "Emily," she began, folding her hands, "we understand that life is going to be much harder for you now, without Drew." I said nothing. "So, we've been thinking. It would be best for everyone if you sold this house and moved back with your father," she continued, voice almost gentle. "This place is far too large for you now," Samantha chimed in, her tone dripping with mock concern. "Exactly. There's no point in keeping a house you can't possibly maintain on your own." I felt my heart pound, but I kept my voice steady. "This house was bought by Drew and me. It is legally mine." Patricia's smile flickered. "We'll see about that." You'll be hearing from our lawyers soon. I stood, forcing calm into every muscle. Then I suggest you let him handle it, because you are no longer welcome here. For a beat, neither woman moved. Then Samantha tugged Patricia's sleeve. They left without another word, but not before Patricia cast one last icy glance my way. That night I sat with my father at the kitchen table, my hands trembling around a cup of tea. They came here, Dad. They actually think they can take this from me. He reached across, covering my hand with his own. They won't, he said firmly, not while you fight for what's yours. And fight I would. The very next morning, I called Amanda Reed, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney Rachel had recommended. Amanda, I said, voice steel beneath the weariness, I need your help. They're trying to take my home. Then we'll make sure they can't, she replied. We'll start by finding out exactly what Drew left behind and what they think they can claim. Her confidence was a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. 2 days later, as I sifted through Drew's home office, I found a sealed envelope wedged beneath a stack of documents. My heart caught as I opened it, and inside was a letter from Drew's lawyer. I thought of everything, Emily. His familiar handwriting began. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. But know this. Everything I have, everything we built, is meant for you and your father. No one else. Tears blurred the words, but the meaning was clear. I wasn't alone in this fight. What hidden truths lie within the letter Drew left behind, and will it be enough to protect Emily from the storm Patricia and Samantha are about to unleash? And when grief and betrayal collide, how far would you go to defend the last piece of love and life you've fought to hold on to? Join me in Chapter 5, where the battle lines are drawn and one woman's quiet resolve turns into a fight for everything that matters. Chapter 5, The Letter That Changed Everything. The envelope was plain, no markings, no warning, but inside it held the power to rewrite everything they thought they could take from me. I sat in Drew's study long after the sun had set, the only light a small desk lamp casting a soft glow across papers I could no longer bring myself to read. The letter lay open before me, Drew's words, steady and deliberate. A voice I feared I'd never hear again. If you're reading this, something has gone wrong. But know this, everything I have, everything we built is meant for you and your father. No one else. I traced the lines with trembling fingers. Grief swelled in my chest once more, but beneath it now stirred something else, resolve. Patricia and Samantha thought they could circle like vultures. They didn't know Drew had seen them coming, and neither did they know that I was done being polite. The next morning I took the letter along with every legal document I could find and drove to Amanda Reed's office downtown. Amanda greeted me with a firm handshake and a gaze that missed nothing. Her office was stark but elegant, lined with shelves of well-worn legal volumes and framed degrees. You said this was urgent, she began, motioning for me to sit. I placed the letter on her desk, followed by Drew's recent correspondence with his lawyer. He left this, I said, voice steady despite the storm inside me. And Patricia Bennett is threatening to take the house. Amanda read carefully, her expression unreadable at first, then slowly shifting into something close to satisfaction. He was smart, she said softly, very smart. This letter, combined with the documents here, gives us a strong position. They're coming for everything, I added. I won't let them. Then neither will I, Amanda replied. First, we'll verify if a formal will was filed. If it was, and if it mirrors this letter, Patricia won't have a legal leg to stand on. She leaned forward, eyes sharp. Emily, this may get ugly. Are you prepared for that? I met her gaze without flinching. I've been through worse. That evening, the first official blow landed. An envelope arrived, hand-delivered, from James Walker, attorney for Patricia and Samantha. The letter inside was thinly veiled aggression dressed in legal formality. Mrs. Bennet, my clients assert that as members of the decedent's immediate family, they are entitled to a share of his estate, including the Spokane property. We advise you to vacate the premises voluntarily to avoid protracted litigation. I read the words aloud to my father at the kitchen table, his face tightened, eyes flashing beneath his lined brow. They didn't even show up to his funeral, I said bitterly, and now they want to erase everything he left us. Then we fight, my father said simply. You have the truth on your side, and you're not alone. The next morning, Amanda called with news. Emily, we found the will. My breath caught. Drew filed it 6 months ago with his attorney, Matthew Hayes. I've scheduled an appointment for you to hear it read. My heart pounded. When? Tomorrow morning. I hung up the phone, both dread and determination coiling in my chest. I spent that night pacing the living room, the letter from Drew clutched in my hands. You're stronger than you think, his words echoed in my mind. And I've done everything I can to protect you. I stared out the window into the dark, the house eerily still around me. They think they've already won, I whispered to the silence. But they don't know what's coming. The morning of the will reading, Spokane was wrapped in fog, a fitting mirror for the tension twisting in my chest. I arrived at Matthew Hayes' law office with my father by my side. The building was an old brick structure, solid and unyielding, much like the resolve I forced myself to wear like armor. You ready? My father asked quietly as we waited in the reception area. I have to be, I whispered back. Amanda joined us moments later, her calm presence a welcome anchor. Together, we were led into a wood-paneled conference room where Matthew Hayes awaited. He rose as we entered, offering a firm handshake. His eyes were kind but professional, the gaze of a man who understood exactly what was at stake. Mrs. Bennet, he began, thank you for coming. I understand this is a difficult time. Thank you, I replied, voice steady. Please, let's begin. Matthew opened a file and began reading. I, Andrew Bennet, being of sound mind, do hereby bequeath all my possessions, including our home, vehicles, and financial assets, to my beloved wife, Emily Carter Bennet. It is my wish that these resources be used to provide for her and for her father, William Carter, whom I have come to love as my own. The room seemed to hold its breath. Tears blurred my vision, but I held them back, clutching my father's hand beneath the table. Matthew continued, his tone unwavering. It is further my wish that no other parties shall claim any portion of my estate, unless explicitly stated herein, which they are not. When he finished, he handed me a sealed envelope. Your husband also left this letter for you, he said softly. My hands trembled as I opened it. My dearest Emily, if you're reading this, the worst has happened. I am so sorry. But know this, you are never alone. You and your father are my family. I've done everything I can to ensure you both are protected. Stay strong, live fully, and remember, love outlasts everything. Drew. The dam broke. Silent tears streamed down my cheeks as my father gently squeezed my shoulder. He was a good man, he said, voice thick with emotion. And you're going to honor him by standing your ground. I nodded, wiping my tears. Yes, I will. That afternoon, as if summoned by some cruel instinct, Patricia and Samantha arrived unannounced. I saw their car pull up through the window. Sleek, black, and cold as the women inside, I met them at the door, letter from the attorney still fresh in my hand. Patricia's smile was a brittle mask. Emily, she began with faux warmth, we need to talk about the estate. There's nothing to discuss, I cut in, voice firm. Drew's will is clear. Everything belongs to me and my father. Samantha's eyes narrowed. Surely you don't intend to cut us off entirely? You cut yourselves off the moment you tried to take what wasn't yours, I replied coldly. Patricia's smile faltered. You think a piece of paper will stop us? She hissed. We'll see you in court. Then I'll see you there, I said calmly. But you won't win. For a moment they stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. Not the grieving widow, not the fragile girl. A woman who would fight and win. Without another word, they turned and left, the door closing behind them like the final toll of a warning bell. That night, I sat with my father in the garden Drew and I had once dreamed of filling with life. "They're coming for us," I said quietly. "Then let them come," he replied. "We'll face them together." I looked up at the stars, Drew's letter clutched to my chest. "You gave me everything, Drew," I whispered. "Now I'll protect it, no matter what it takes." But even as I prepared to fight, life had one more secret waiting to change everything again. Will Patricia and Samantha's looming legal threat truly be enough to shake Emily, now that Drew's final words have armed her with both strength and purpose? And when you're fighting not just for home, but for the very memory of the love you lost, how far would you go to protect it? Stay with me in Chapter 6, where new life, new battles, and one final twist will test Emily's courage like never before. Chapter 6. The life he left me to protect. 2 blue lines. 2 tiny, life-changing lines. And in that moment, I knew exactly what I was fighting for. It began with a wave of nausea that wouldn't go away. At first, I blamed the stress. The endless legal maneuvering with Patricia and Samantha had left me raw, sleepless. Some days I barely remembered to eat. Others, food tasted like ash. But when the queasiness persisted, creeping into each morning with unsettling regularity, a small voice whispered the one possibility I hadn't dared consider. "No," I told myself, "not now. It's too soon. It's too much." And yet, a part of me knew. Deep down, my body had already told the truth my heart wasn't ready to hear. The test sat on the bathroom counter, its timer ticking down the longest 3 minutes of my life. I paced the small tile floor, fingers pressed to my lips, tears threatening to rise before I even saw the result. "Please," I whispered, though I didn't know what I was asking for. Confirmation or denial. When the timer buzzed, I forced myself to look. 2 blue lines, clear, unmistakable. My knees gave way as I sank to the floor, the weight of the moment crashing over me. Grief and joy warred within me in equal measure. The agony of what Drew would never see, and the breathtaking wonder that a part of him still lived within me. "Drew," I sobbed, clutching the test to my chest. "You left me more than I ever knew." I don't remember how long I stayed there. Eventually, I rose on unsteady legs and made my way to the living room where my father sat reading. He looked up instantly, eyes narrowing in concern. "Emily, what's wrong?" I held out the test with trembling hands. "Dad, I'm pregnant." For a beat, silence hung between us. Then my father wheeled closer and took my hands in his. "Sweetheart," he said, voice thick with emotion. "This is a blessing. You're not alone anymore. This child, it's a gift from Drew." The dam broke again. I collapsed into his embrace, tears flowing freely. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," I whispered. "You are," he said firmly. "And when you can't be, I will be, for both of you." In that moment, something shifted deep within me. The fear remained, but it no longer ruled me, because now I wasn't fighting just for myself. I was fighting for the life growing inside me. The days that followed blurred with purpose. I scheduled doctor's appointments, began prenatal vitamins, researched everything I could about pregnancy. At night, I'd sit in Drew's old armchair, one hand resting on my belly, reading his journal aloud, letting our child hear the voice of the man who had loved them before they ever existed. "Your father was brave," I whispered into the quiet room. "And you will be too." Word of my pregnancy spread faster than I expected. I wasn't naive. I knew Patricia and Samantha would use it as ammunition. And sure enough, their next visit confirmed it. They arrived unannounced once more, faces hard with faux concern. "We heard the news," Patricia said smoothly, gaze flicking to my stomach. "You must be overwhelmed." "I'm doing just fine," I replied coolly. Samantha snorted. It's rather convenient, isn't it, to suddenly be carrying his child now? I felt the heat rise in my chest, but forced myself to remain calm. My personal life is none of your concern, I said evenly, and neither is this house. Patricia's eyes narrowed. You think that child will protect you? It won't change the law. No, I replied, voice steel beneath the softness, but it will change me. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act, part quiet joy, part simmering tension. I poured myself into preparing for the baby. Rachel helped transform the guest room into a nursery. Soft creams and pale blues, a crib my father and I assembled together. Each evening, I would sit in the room alone, running my hands over my growing belly, whispering to the life inside me, "You are loved," I would say. "You are wanted, and I will fight for you with everything I have." Patricia and Samantha, meanwhile, grew bolder. Their lawyer filed a formal claim against the estate, an attempt to contest Drew's will on grounds of emotional duress and improper influence. Amanda called me the moment she received the notice. "They're desperate," she said, "and they'll use anything they can, including your pregnancy, to paint you as unstable." "Then we show them I'm not," I replied, voice steady. "I want this fight, not just for me, but for my child." The hearing date was set. I spent the days leading up to it gathering every piece of evidence, every document Drew had so carefully prepared. On the morning of the hearing, I stood before the mirror in my bedroom. My belly was visible now, a quiet but powerful reminder of what was at stake. I rested a hand over it and whispered, "We're ready. We can do this." My father wheeled into the room, dressed in his sharpest suit. "You look strong, sweetheart," he said softly. "I feel strong," I answered, and for the first time since Drew's death, I truly meant it. The courthouse was cold and clinical, all sharp angles and echoing footsteps. Patricia and Samantha were already there when we arrived, seated with their lawyer, faces hard and unreadable. But when Patricia's eyes flicked to my rounded stomach, a flash of something, bitterness, perhaps fear, crossed her face. Amanda leaned close. "Remember, you don't have to say much. The will speaks for itself. Just stay composed." "I will," I said. And I did. Throughout the proceedings, as their lawyers spun tales of manipulation and undue influence, I sat tall and still. When asked to speak, I did so calmly, clearly, recounting the love Drew and I shared and the life we had built together. Amanda presented the will, the letter, the legal filings. By the time she finished, even the judge seemed weary of Patricia and Samantha's transparent attempt to seize what was not theirs. "Based on the evidence presented," the judge ruled firmly, "the will stands. Mrs. Bennet retains full ownership of the estate. This case is closed." A rush of relief swept through me, but I kept my expression composed. Patricia, however, did not. As we exited the courtroom, she blocked my path, eyes blazing. "You think this is over?" she hissed. "You think carrying that child will save you?" I met her gaze without flinching. "I don't need saving," I said quietly. "I already won." The weeks that followed brought a peace I hadn't known in months. I focused on preparing for the baby, on nurturing the life Drew had left me to protect. One afternoon, as I watered the small garden in our backyard, the baby kicked a soft flutter beneath my hand. I laughed through tears. "You're strong, little one," I whispered, "just like your father." But peace, I would soon learn, can be fragile. One evening, a letter arrived, unsigned, its contents chilling. "You may think you've won, but you've made enemies you can't imagine. Watch your back." My hands shook as I read it, fear and fury intertwining. "You will not scare me," I whispered to the empty room. "I will protect this life, no matter what." Thanks for watching Day of Revenge. If you love drama, secrets, and jaw-dropping twists, you're in the right place. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more incredible stories.